So, in a wonderful lecture, Professor Severino Tesser has today shown, based on her rich experience and plenty of expertise in numerous war-torn countries in the world, that lasting peace is to be built bottom-up and not top-down, via grassroots initiatives and not via policy documents. So, in my own contribution today, I would like to explore with all of you how we can contribute to building peace in a university, and more specifically, in this university. Now, at first sight, and particularly if you follow the news lately, universities don't seem like prime examples of peace. Over the last 2 years, for instance, we have seen pro-life demonstrations that were taken to be deeply offensive by some people. For instance, staff members and students who had had abortions themselves. We also witnessed how some other staff members signed the so-called Nashville Declaration, which rejects homosexuality as sinful. Maybe you remember it a few years ago. Are colleagues and students still safe, for instance, in classes taught by those professors? And of course, we saw numerous protests and demonstrations in relation to the war in Israel and Gaza. We witnessed, for instance, how some Jewish faculty and students no longer feel welcome or even safe in the university, how pro-Palestine demonstrators were afraid of losing their jobs, how some of those demonstrators physically damaged property in universities or assaulted board members, and how the police at times reacted violently to that. Not exactly a peaceful picture. So how can we make universities, and this university, a place of peace in times of depolarization and conflict? I will argue that to do so, we need less radical talking and more radical conversation. And in order to do that, I think we first need to return to the fundamental issue of what it is to be a university. And I take it to be crucial in our times that the university is primarily an epistemic institution. In other words, our first responsibility is to acquire knowledge, to hand that down to next generations, and to disseminate that knowledge in society. We are not primarily a political institution, nor are we primarily concerned with things like business or amusement or justice or aesthetics. If you're not sure about the latter, just look at some university buildings. And of course, I'm not talking about this beautiful brutalist building. Right. Believe me, you'll come to appreciate it. No, we are primarily an epistemic institution, concerned with knowledge. So, the Magna Carta Universitatem, a document signed by hundreds of universities worldwide now, is crystal clear on this. It says our research and teaching ought to be intellectually and morally independent of any political influence and economic interests. So we should pursue knowledge and understanding, even when that is politically unwelcome, morally sensitive, or against the majority view. Of course, universities also have a moral and political dimension. For instance, that same document says we ought to seek to benefit humanity, and we ought to contribute to sustainability, and rightly so. But whenever they conflict, the two, our primary responsibility is knowledge. Knowledge comes first. And this, I believe, is reflected in our tools. Our primary means in the university are not force or pressure, but conversation, dialogue, the rejection of intolerance. In critical engagement, the founding father of this university, Abraham Kuyper, said, "We bless each other by antagonism." A wonderful phrase. Now, don't get me wrong. This is no plea against demonstrations. On the contrary, demonstrations are pivotal and a fundamental right in our democratic societies, and sometimes we desperately need them. What we need more specifically, though, is demonstrations based on knowledge and open towards dialogue and conversation. So less radical talking, more radical thinking, more radical performative listening, more radical discussion, more radical critical engagement. Now, straight away, I would like to dispel two important myths that surround this idea of a dialogue. And I think it is crucial to understand these myths in order to better understand how, in the university, dialogue is our primary means to peace. The first is that dialogue is boring, or soft, or grey. It is not. I think very often dialogue is the most radical thing we can do, and staying in dialogue. So by way of example, take the situation in which some professors signed a Nashville Declaration, which rejects homosexuality as sinful. There are two easy ways out of this situation, and both of them, I think, do not contribute to peace. The first one is to say, well, there's freedom of expression. Take it or leave it. Deal with it. This is their view. And the problem here is that those views aren't truly challenged. The other way out is just to cancel and fire those professors, right? And if you do that consistently on a number of issues, you'll end up with a homogeneous community who believes the exact same set of things. A small bubble, remarkably different from the rest of society. The most difficult thing to do, but I believe the only viable path to peace in a situation like that, is to engage in sincere and critical dialogue about those views, to not give up on one another. As Desmond Tutu once famously said, if you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. So, dare to talk to your epistemic adversary. How much braver is that than talking to the like-minded? All right, there's a second common misunderstanding, I think, and it is that dialogue promotes the middle position. It does not, or quite often it does not. The middle position may be right, but it may also be wrong. We sometimes need radical positions, and sometimes even at the far sides of the political spectrum. Why is that? Well, for instance, because there are radical wrongs in the world. For example, those related to sexism or racism or the exploitation of our planet. We sometimes need a radical stance. It should be a stance, though, that is always open to conversation and dialogue. And I think this matters. Remember that we live in times in which, for instance, the international order of the sovereignty of nations and the respect for human rights have not been challenged, since World War II, to the degree that we witness nowadays. For example, by someone who calls himself the peace president. Right, so without sincere and critical engagements, calls for peace can easily become instruments to silence people or to look away, to perpetuate injustice. I believe in radical dialogue, precisely because we live in radical and polarized times. Now, research shows that what is called cognitive polarization, so the views of people growing increasingly apart, has remarkably not increased that much over the last few decades. And I believe that even if it did, that wouldn't be too much of a problem. A decent democracy can handle a bit of disagreement, or it flourishes by way of it. What has changed, though, is what is called affective polarization. So increasingly, we see each other no longer as epistemic peers or opponents to be engaged, but as the enemy to be beaten, sometimes even in the double sense of the word. Dialogue breaks through this dehumanizing approach and the underlying cosmic dualism that divides the entire world into right and wrong, light and darkness. Nothing in between the two. Dialogue creates physical proximity so that I can see in the eyes of the other person their humanity and my own. It makes me realize that we should steer away from belief packages. If I know one of your beliefs, I can tell all the other beliefs. No, we can disagree on certain things and agree on other things. It may even change my mind on some issues. We can genuinely learn from one another. It also plainly reveals, the dialogue, that we are not primarily our beliefs on whatever issue. We are first and foremost friends or colleagues, fellow citizens. Now, I believe in our pursuit of peace over the last few decades. We have been hindered and plagued at times, I would say, by what you could call neoliberal and in some other cases postmodernist conceptions of peace. And on these conceptions of peace, peace is primarily the absence of something, the absence of war, the absence of conflict, the absence of polarization. And the idea then is that we live in peace if everybody can do whatever they like, as long as they don't harm others. As long as that harm is absent, we're good. As soon as it is present, we are in trouble. That's basically the picture. And I believe this is a bleak and an untenable view. For one thing, it is deeply individualistic, and it doesn't really provide an attractive alternative picture on which people with radically different views can somehow live together. I think we need a richer picture of peace. For example, the one offered by the American philosopher Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff, who once received an honorary doctorate from this university. So in his view, to live in peace is to live in harmony, despite differences, with the people in your group, with those beyond your group, with nature, with God, and with yourself. And in order to do that, to pursue the rights of all, and to delight in that. So, on this picture, justice and peace go hand in hand. Or to use an old image from Psalm 85, justice and peace embrace one another. One more image. In ancient Greece, there was this famous idea of a captain when in the Strait of Messina had to steer the ship between two perils at sea in order to survive. On the one hand, there was the six-headed monster named Scylla, and on the other hand, there was the whirlpool called Charybdis. And I think we can apply this to the issue at hand. Scylla could stand for the idea that truth is mine. I own the truth. The only thing I need to do is to explain it again to the other. The other one, Charybdis, is the idea that everybody has their own truth. Right? One is not more right than the other. It's just a matter of perspective. And I think both of these are deeply corruptive to the nature and calling of the university. If we want to be a university where peace is pursued, we ought to rigorously and humbly pursue truth. And in doing so, take it that we can learn as much from the other as the other person can learn from me. All right, almost time to wrap up. When we look at governments, I, like Professor Otesser, have become rather skeptical of their ability and sometimes even their willingness to pursue peace. So think of governments like Russia, the one of Russia in the USA, Israel, or Hamas in Gaza. I would say even the Netherlands over the last 2 years, to be frank with you. Admittedly, I'm much more optimistic about the board of this university and their willingness and ability to pursue peace. But don't get me wrong, I think even they cannot realize peace. It is not within their power to do so. Of course, they may give an example and set the tone and the like. But whether we, as the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, are a partner in peace building is up to us. That is students, faculty, supporting staff, alumni, partners. It is up to us whether we stay away from radicalization and polarization, that is, us versus them thinking, or demonizing and dehumanizing the other person, reducing complex moral reality to black and white thinking or a metaphysical battle between good and evil. It is up to us whether we defend and embody a different attitude, a radical attitude of connecting with one another, to look each other in the eye, to engage in conversation and critique, and to live together despite, or maybe perhaps in virtue of our differences. I think if we learn to do so, increasingly, there is ample hope for the future. Finally, let me wish us all a happy birthday, and peace be with you.